This was submitted before the legislature, again I say, in 1945 by Walter Cool. Walter Cool also wrote a letter to René Lévesque when they talked about separation, and he clearly stated Canada did not confederate. So Quebec doesn't have to separate from Canada. It already is sovereign. So what happens is what Canada has to do to separate from the corrupt de facto government in Ottawa is to establish a constitution and set a de jure government of the people by the people. And this is what we want to start doing in Alberta. Canada is a service corporation. It was created as a service corporation by Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Okay? So as far as I'm concerned, we don't want these services. They're doing a terrible job, right? So you're fired. We want to establish our own government. So we want to change the political system. So why should we try and have a leader of opposition? We, the Canadian people, should be the opposition. We, the Canadian people, should appoint our Governor General. We, the Canadian people, should appoint our police service commissioner, right? We have the right to appoint our health commissioner. This is what we should do. Not a government, have political appointments, then turn around and tell us what we're speaking for. If we don't like it, we're going to wait another 4 years. The system is broken. If we have a premier of Alberta and he doesn't listen to the Canadian people, we could fire you the same day. If you're providing a service, you're not providing a good service, you're fired. We'll find somebody else to replace you. Simple. The political system is broken in Canada. It needs to be reformed. And we also have to turn around and confederate, bring Canada together, but not under a de facto government that does not represent the people, but the political interests of the political parties and elites.
My name is Virginia Bruno, and I'm here to represent First Nations of Alberta and Canada. Now, the First Nations people in the first beginning of Canada were not consulted in a trilateral agreement between the federal government, the provincial government, and the First Nations people. We've never been taken seriously. We've never been consulted in anything that's happening to Canada as First Nations people. And so my stance is, why aren't the First Nations people consulted? Because when they signed the treaties way back when, there was agents there who had just an X and that's it. They didn't know how to speak English. The agents did, and so they signed for the First Nations people. A lot of them did not know what they were doing. So they signed their rights away to the federal government. So the federal government now put them on little pieces of land, which they gave them a hoe and a sigh, and told the First Nations people, they didn't give them a house, they had little tents on reserves, and they said, you go to it, go and till your land, and that's what you're going to get for a piece of land. Well, the First Nations people did accept it. They accepted, they did it, but then they realized that, why aren't we having houses like everybody else? Why are we living in third world countries at that time? So they decided to ask for houses because that was assigned in the treaties. So they got a house built on reserves. When they got a house built on the reserves, the federal government did not place any services for water or anything in ways of water treatment plants or anything like that. So the First Nations people decided, okay, well, we're going to ask for the water situation. And in 1980, Mulroney government gave the First Nations people the water cistern system on reserves. Now, when they gave the water cistern systems on reserves to the First Nations people, they did not maintain those cisterns. So a lot of their cisterns are getting broken, and they're getting cracked. And what gets in broken cisterns and cracks? But mice, frogs, bugs, snakes in them. Also, dirt comes out of those taps when they turn them on. So this is unacceptable in a rich country that we have in Canada. Why hasn't the First Nations people been put first on the list as far as any services for water and housing infrastructure? I'll tell you why. Because they don't want the First Nations to flourish. They want the First Nations to possibly just die off and move to cities, because it's called Agenda 21. Now, First Nations are not going to go for the Agenda 21. They're not moving to cities. They're not. And because of this, the federal government is making it really hard for the First Nations people in regards to getting any services on reserves. So this is where I stand. This is where my stance is as a First Nations woman. I know my rights. I know that we have, there's money allocated for water and housing for First Nations reserves. I know that there is. Now, when the federal government gives $44 billion annually to the Department of Indian Affairs out of the trust fund that is not taxpayers' money, by the way. When they give that money to the First Nations for their water and housing, it's in the budget of the $44 billion given to the Department of Indian Affairs. The Department of Indian Affairs, by the time it trickles down to every department, only 5% gets to every reserve in Canada. It's no wonder nothing happens in regards to water or housing or even roads. So I remember a couple of years ago in near Cold Lake, Saddle Lake, and Cahuan, it was massive rain like we had, and the water trucks couldn't get to the houses, and so the First Nations people were without water for about 2 weeks. So that's unacceptable. And even if they do have water, they still have to buy their water from town, because that, like I said, the cisterns are broken, and it's a Band-Aid solution that the Mulroney government put in place in 1980s, and so this has to change. I remember as a child growing up on the reserve, I know exactly what it's like. We had cream cans, and my dad went to town. He bought water for 25 cents that filled up our 4 cream cans, brought it back every week, and we had our water to drink. But to have a bath, you had to get the pump from the water. Water from the pump, and have a bath, and everybody had to share that water. All the little kids, right? And so it was unacceptable in the 1970s. That's not too long ago. So why is that? Because I said we have to develop the water and housing infrastructure on First Nations reserves by allocating the money that's set aside for First Nations, and fix that system. Because if you don't do it, you're going to have people who are sick all the time, who are cannot develop their own lands, and always have this. I don't want to say burden, but in actuality it is a burden, because they are getting sick, and it can be fixed by having water treatment plants and sewage lagoons for First Nations. And that's all I'm here for. I want to get water and housing on First Nations reserves. And I have a complete plan, which I gave to the provincial government in August of last year. And he sent somebody, he got someone to phone me and say, oh, you got to get your funding from SEEP. So I phoned SEEP, and it was really hard, a loophole to get any funding from SEEP. Meanwhile, he takes Premier Kenney, looks at my proposal, I'm sure, because now the ball is in his court. He's got my proposal before him, and it is an extensive plan. And so he looks at it and says, okay, we're going to invest heavily in First Nations water, which is a good thing. I'm not disputing that. But the fact of the matter is, what kind of infrastructure and what kind of monies are going where, and what does it mean by he's investing heavily? What does that entail? Does that entail sewage lagoons? Does that entail water treatment plants, which is very necessary, or is that just fixing the cisterns for the reserves, which is not going to work very much? So this is why I'm here. I want to get water treatment plants and sewage lagoons for First Nations reserves, and the only way to do that is by allocating that money, the $44 billion, and working with Alberta's reserves first, then going across Canada to do the same.